Hey guys, welcome to the Read Aloud for May 27th. Here we go. That's good enough for today. Alright. Let's see. But this year, now that Miss Frisbee had faced the problem, she did not see any answer except to hope that the day would not come too early. In another month, according to Mr. Ages, Timothy would be strong enough. Perhaps she was only borrowing trouble. One warm day, she told herself, does not make a summer. No, nor even a spring. She walked through the garden and saw ahead of her a small figure she knew. It was a lady shrew, a tiny thing scarcely bigger than a peanut, but with a wit as sharp as her teeth. She lived in a simple hole in the ground a few yards away. Miss Frisbee met her often and had grown to like her. Though shrews are generally unpopular, having a reputation for short tempers and extremely large appetites. Good morning, said Miss Frisbee. Ah, Miss Frisbee, good morning indeed. Too good is what I'm thinking. The shrew was holding a stalk of straw, which she now thrust into the earth. It went down easily for 2 inches or more before it bent in her hand. Look at that. The top of the frost is already gone. Another few days like this and it'll all be gone. Then we'll have that tractor in here again, breaking everything up. So soon? Do you really think so? Asked Miss Frisbee, her worry returning in a rush, stronger than before. He plows when the frost is gone. Remember that spring of '65, the year he plowed on the 11th day of March, and on Sunday at that? I moved down to the woods that night and nearly froze to death in a miserable hollow log, and that day came after a week of days just like this. Miss Frisbee did remember it. Her family, too, had shivered through those chilly nights, for the fact was, the earlier moving day came, the colder the nights were likely to be. Oh dear, she said, I hope it doesn't happen this year. Poor Timothy's too sick to move. Sick, is he? Take him to Mr. Ages. I've been myself, but he was too weak to get out of bed, and still is. I'm sorry to hear that. Then we must hope for another frost, or that tractor will break down. I wish someone would drive a tractor through his house and see how he likes it. So muttering, the lady shrew moved off, and Miss Frisbee continued across the garden. The remark was illogical, of course, for they both knew that without Mr. Fitzgibbon's plow, there would be no garden to live in at all, and there was no way he could turn the earth without also turning up their house. Or was there? What the shrew had said was meant to be sympathetic, but it was not helpful. It meant, Miss Frisbee realized, that she, too, could see no solution to the problem. But that did not mean that there was none. She remembered something her husband, Mr. Frisbee, used to say, all doors are hard to unlock until you have the key. All right, she must try to find the key, but where? Whom to ask? And then, as if to make things worse, she heard the sound that filled her with alarm. It came from across the fence in the farmyard. A loud, sputtering roar. It was Mr. Fitzgibbon starting his tractor. 5 days. The sound of the tractor did not necessarily mean that Mr. Fitzgibbon was getting ready to plow. He used it for many other things, hauling hay and firewood, for instance, and mowing and clearing snow in the winter. Mrs. Frisbee reminded herself of all of this as she hurried over the corner to the corner post. That was a very thick fence post at the corner of the garden nearest the farmhouse and the tractor shed. She had discovered long ago that it had a few inches above the ground a convenient knot hole with a hollow place inside it which she could hide when she had reason to, and to watch what was going on in the yard. The cat, Dragon, also knew of its existence, so she had to look sharply when she came out. She came up careful behind the post, stared this way and that, and then darted around it up into the hole. All clear. Mr. Fitzgibbon had backed the tractor out of the big cluttered shed where he kept it, leaving the motor idling. He climbed down from the seat and called to the house. In a moment, his older son Paul came out, closing the door carefully behind him. Paul, at 15, was a quiet, hard-working boy, rather clumsy in his movements, but strong and careful about his chores. In a few seconds, he was followed by his younger brother Billy, who at age 12 was noisier and had an annoying habit of skimming rocks across the grass at anything that moved. Miss Frisbee did not much care for Billy. "All right, boys," said Mr. Fitzgibbon, "let's haul it out and see about that linchpin. It was just about worn through last fall, I remember," Paul said. The boys disappeared into the shed, and Mr. Fitzgibbon remounted the tractor. He turned it around and backed it slowly toward the shed so that the rear of it was out of Miss Frisbee's sight. There was some clanking and clanging inside the shed while Mr. Fitzgibbon looked over his shoulder, working some levers on the side of the tractor. All set, he shifted the gears and eased the tractor forward again. Hitched behind it, clear of the ground, was the plow. Miss Frisbee's heart sank. Surely he was not going to start now. But as soon as he had the plow out in the sunlight, Mr. Fitzgibbon turned the tractor's engine off. It died with a sputter, and they all gathered around the plow hitch. "Sure enough," said Mr. Fitzgibbon, "she's just about ready to shear. Paul, I'm glad you remembered. If I ordered it today, Henderson will have a new one in 3 or 4 days." "It took 5 days last time," Paul said. "5 then. That's just about right anyway. It's too wet to plow now, but maybe 5 days like this ought to dry the ground out. Let's grease up while we got it out, Billy. Get the grease gun." In her hiding place, Miss Frisbee breathed a sigh of relief and then began to worry again immediately. 5 days, although a respite, was too short. 3 weeks, Mr. Aegis had said, would be the soonest Timothy could get out of bed, the soonest he could live through a chill night without getting pneumonia again. She sighed and felt like weeping. If only the summer house were as warm as the cinder block house. But it was not, and even if it were, he could not make the long journey. They might try to carry him, but what was the use of that? Only to have him get sick again after the first night there. She might, she thought, go back to Mr. Aegis and see if he had any ideas that would help. Was there some medicine that would make Timothy get strong sooner? She doubted it. Surely if he had such medicine, he would have given it to her the first time. She was thinking about this when she climbed out through the knothole and slithered to the ground below, not 10 feet from the cat. Dragon lay stretched out in the sunlight, but he was not asleep. His head was up and his yellow eyes were open, staring in her direction. She gasped in terror and whirled around the fence post to put it between her and him. Then, without pausing, she set out on a dash across the garden as fast as she could, expecting at any instant to hear the cat scream and feel his great claws on her back. She reached the shrew's hole and considered for a fraction of a second diving into it, but it was far too small. Then she glanced back over her shoulder and saw an amazing sight. The cat had not moved at all. He was lying exactly as before, except that now one of his eyes was closed. The other, however, was still looking straight at her. So she did not pause, but raced on. Finally, when she was a safe distance away, 2/3 across the garden and nearly home, she stopped and looked again more carefully. The cat still lay there and seemed to have gone to sleep. It was so odd, so unheard of. She could hardly believe it. Feeling quite safe, but puzzled, she looked for a vantage point from which she could see better. By rights, she should be dead, and though she had escaped by what seemed almost a miracle, she scolded herself for having been so careless. If the cat had killed her, who would have taken care of the children? She saw a dead asparagus plant, stiff, tall, with branches like a small tree. She climbed it and from near the top looked back to the farmyard. Mr. Fitzgibbon and his sons had finished greasing the tractor and had gone on somewhere else, but the cat still lay on the grass, seemingly asleep. Why had he not chased her? Was it possible that, close as she had been, he had not seen her? She could not believe that. The only explanation she could think of was that he had just finished a very large meal and was feeling so satisfied and lazy he did not want to take the trouble to get up. But that was almost as unbelievable. Certainly it had never happened before. Was it possible he was sick? Then on what had already been a day of oddities and alarms, she noticed something else strange. Beyond the cat, quite far beyond, between the barn and the house, she saw what looked like a troop of dark gray figures marching in columns. Marching? Not exactly, but moving slowly and in a line. They were rats. There were a dozen of them, and at first she could not quite see what they were up to. And then she saw something else moving. Between them and behind them, it looked like a thick piece of rope, a long piece, maybe 20 feet. No, it was stiffer than rope. It was electrical cable, the heavy black kind used for outdoor wiring and strung on telephone poles. The rats were hauling it laboriously through the grass, inching it along in the direction of a very large wild rose bush in the far corner of the yard. Miss Frisbee quickly guessed where they were taking it, though she could not guess why. In that rose bush, concealed and protected by the dense tangles of fiercely sharp thorns, was the entrance to a rat hole. All the animals knew about it and were careful to stay away. But what would the rats want with such a long piece of wire? Miss Frisbee could not imagine. Even more curious, how did they dare to pull it across the yard in broad daylight when the cat was right there? The rats were bigger than Miss Frisbee and could be, when necessary, dangerous fighters, but they were no match for Dragon. She watched them for quite a long time. It was obvious they knew exactly what they were doing, and they looked as well drilled as a group of soldiers. They had about 25 yards to go to reach the rose bush. As if at a signal, which, however, she was far too away to hear, they would all pull together, moving the wire about a foot, and then they would pause, rest, and heave again. It was about 20 minutes before the first rat disappeared into the bush. A little later, the last bit of wire disappeared behind them like a thin black snake, and Miss Frisbee climbed down from the asparagus bush. All that time, the cat had slept on. A favor for Jeremy. In her worry about moving day, in watching the tractor, the cat, and finally the rats, Miss Frisbee had forgotten that she had set out originally to get some corn for supper. Now she remembered. So instead of continuing to her house, she turned to the far corner of the garden, at the stump at the edge of the woods. She was a little tired after her dash from the cat, so she walked along slowly, feeling the warmth of the sun and the smell of the breeze. This mild breeze, carrying the moist essence of early spring, caused a dead leaf to flutter here and there, and across the garden near the fence it moved something that sparkled in the sunlight. This caught the corner of Miss Frisbee's eyes. She glanced at it, saw that it was only a bit of tinfoil, or aluminum foil, blown from somewhere, and she looked away again. And then she looked back, for at that moment a black object plummeted from the sky, and she recognized her friend Jeremy the crow. A thought crossed Miss Frisbee's mind. She changed direction again, and moving more quickly, ran across the earth to where Jeremy stood. He was hopping around the shiny piece of foil, eyeing it from one direction or another. All right, we'll read more tomorrow.